There could be one major reason why your tracks are not hitting as hard as the tracks that you love, and that could be mixing. So today we're gonna go through the major mixing issues that I see producers making and how can you solve them one by one in your tracks as well. But before we begin, let me know over here in the comment sections below, what do you struggle the most when mixing your songs? Is it the gain staging, EQ masking, stereo width, or is it something else? Let me know over here in the description below and let's get started with this video. Let's go. When you start mixing your song, the most crucial step that I see a lot of producers avoiding is not having a goal for their songs. They start tweaking their mix without having a clear direction of where they want to go with their mix. For example, is the low end of this song too quiet or too loud? And you might say that it's too quiet, but if you compare it to Ben Bomer's track, it's actually a bit louder than Ben Bomer's track, but it all depends on what you want to achieve, because if you want to achieve something like this track from Le Youth, then it's actually a bit too quiet and you might need to raise your low end. So it all depends on where you want to go with your song, and having this is crucial to understand not only what to do next, but also when to stop mixing your song and overthinking your mix as well. It's almost like having a guide with what should you do next with your songs. But how do you define what is the mixing goal of your song? A lot of producers don't use reference tracks when mixing their songs, and to me, this is the most important step when mixing a song. And you might ask me, why using reference tracks? Well, essentially with reference tracks, you can define that you want to have the low end of your song as loud as the reference track. And boom! Now you have a direction of where you need to take your low end to. Not only this, but after you mix your song, you can compare if the low end of your mix is as loud as what you've decided to go, and essentially adjust along the way. For example, if you wanted to have a bass line like this song over here from Le Youth called About Us, listen over here while also looking at the spectrum over here in Ableton. The kick and the sub are hitting at -9 dB, as you can see over here in the screen. But now if you listen to our mix, listen where the kick and the bass are hitting over there. And you can see that they are quieter, but at least we know where we need to take them to, -9 dB, right? That's why having a reference track is so important. It's almost like having a guide for the low end, the high end, and also the mid-range for your song that you can just follow and replicate from your reference track into your song. And essentially that's the first step whenever I'm doing a mixing, which takes us to our next point of this video. After you define the goal of your song and define the reference track, it's time to start mixing your song. And it's important to almost never mix your song in solo, which is something that I see some producers doing as well. For example, listen to this pad over here. Is it too MIDI? And the answer is, it depends. It depends on the elements that you have around it. For example, listen to this. Now it doesn't feel too MIDI, and when you mix your song in solo, you might get the best sound individually, but not the best sound collectively with all the elements. The only two reasons that I hit the solo button is if I hear a glitch or a click in my sounds, and that's essentially it. But in essence, always prefer to mix your song in stereo, especially when you're talking about the low end, which takes us to our next point in this video. Now, the main issue that I see a lot of producers doing is not having the kick and the bass at the right place. And if you get your kick and your bass at the right level, your mix is almost 50% done. For example, remember in the reference track that the kick and the bass were at -9 dB? So we're gonna place our song at the same level. Listen over here to our mix while also looking at a spectrum to detect where are our kick and also our bass. You can see it over here that our kick is playing at -12 dB and our bass is playing at -14 dB. So essentially to reach -9, we need to raise 3 dB over here and 5 dB over here. So let's go to Ableton and let's raise this over there. So over here in Ableton, we're gonna raise 3 dB in our kick and 4 dB over here in our sub, and listen to how it sounds like while looking at the spectrum. Now listen to the reference track. It sounds much closer, right? And now you can do the same thing for the rest of your bass. Two important things though. It's important to not fixate yourself in that -9 dB because that varies according to your reference track. And the second thing is that what matters is the relationship between the kick and the bass. Because now that we know that the kick is at the same level as the sub, essentially we can start our next song by placing the bass at the same level as the kick to have a similar balance of what we're doing over here. But then there are the low mids, and that takes us to our next point in this video. In addition to the low end, there's also the low mids, and another big pain point for many mixes. And that's because in the low mid you have a lot of the mid bass, but you also have elements like the pianos, some pads, and sometimes leads as well, which can eventually make your low mids a bit too crowded. For example, listen over here to this song and how it sounds like at the moment. And I'm feeling already that the low mid is a bit too crowded, especially when I compare it to the reference track. If you haven't heard it yet, let's solo that band in the low mids and let's listen exclusively to that band. And you can see it over here that it's playing around -20 LUFS, but when we listen to our song, this is how loud it is. Clearly, it is too loud, and you can see that we're playing around -16 LUFS, which is again louder than the reference track. So how can we uncrowd this mix? Well, essentially, we're gonna gather all the elements that we have in that band, and we're gonna start tweaking them either by lowering them or EQing in that range. So I only have two elements in that range, which is this one and this one. We're gonna first decide which one is the most important element, which is this one over here. And we're gonna start by lowering in that range in the least important element first. And if you still feel that it needs more, you're gonna copy this setting or lower it also over there in the main element as well. Listen over here to the low mids right now. And it is a bit closer. Now compare it to the reference track. It's a bit closer, and essentially we're using the reference track for the target of the low mids as well. It is the target mix, right? And we're gonna start applying this to the high end as well. Now that you've done with your low end and your low mids, we're gonna do the same thing for your mids and for your high end. But for the percussion especially, what I love doing is just using my ears. Instead of using any EQ or metering, I'm just gonna listen and see if the elements that I'm thinking about are louder or quieter than in my reference track. Listen, for example, to this song, but focus on the clap. Is the clap too loud or too quiet? Again, it depends. Let's listen to the reference track and decide. Too quiet, right? So now that I know that it is too quiet, I'm gonna raise my clap until I feel that it matches what I hear in my reference track. So we're gonna go over here. Sounds similar now, and we can apply the same process to almost all elements in the percussions. For example, listen to the hi-hats in the reference track. Can you hear the tss, tss? Now listen to the hi-hats in our track over here. We can barely listen to it, so we're gonna raise it as well until we hear it as loud as in the reference track. And voila, now you can do this to almost all the percussions, and essentially you're gonna balance your percussions as well according to what you listen and like in the reference track. But there are important things to mention though. First, if your percussions are where you want them to be, but you're still missing high end, consider raising the high end in the melodic elements as they can compensate the high end as well. Second, if your reference track has more or less elements, the reference track's percussions can be louder or quieter than yours. So adapt to what you're listening in the reference track. And third, and most importantly, you want to be able to listen to all the percussive elements in your song. And if you're not listening to any element, then that's a problem, and that takes us to our next point in this video. Now, if you don't listen to all the individual elements in your song, or you still feel that your mix is too crowded after doing all these adjustments, you're gonna start needing to cut some elements away from your songs. When you have too many elements in your song, the mix gets too crowded, and it's really hard to achieve a clear mix in that way. So what is the workflow to start deleting some unnecessary elements in your song? Well, essentially, you're gonna turn an element off off and turn it on, and if you don't hear a difference, you can cut it off. Essentially, this element is just crowding your mix and they're not necessary in your stereo mix as well. By cutting it, you're gonna start opening space in your mix, and that will make your mixing life a lot easier as well. But now let's go to our next point in this video. Another really common mixing mistake is having your mix too stereo. And yes, your mixing can be bad if it is too stereo, but when is stereo too much? Well, essentially when you listen to your song in mono and the main elements of your song simply disappears, that's a big problem, because essentially the translation of your song from quality speakers to bad speakers can suffer without mono signal. So listen to this song over here, but focus on the piano of the song. Now listen to it in mono. Where's the piano? It simply disappeared, right? And that's a problem, because when I listened to this song on my cell phone, the piano simply wasn't there, and that's something that I don't want for my mixes, and I'm sure that you don't want it as well. So how can you fix this? Well, essentially you have two ways. First, you can essentially just make the mono signal of your sound louder or the sides quieter, and you can use this rack over here that I've made for Ableton that essentially just makes the mono louder and the sides quieter to make the elements more mono. Or you can simply change the sound design of the element, which might be more effective as well. For example, for this song, I changed the piano to this over here. And now the piano is a bit more centered, which is what I want. I don't want it fully mono, I just want it more centered. But what if you're in doubt and don't know if it is too centered or too stereo? Listen to your reference track, and you can use, again, reference tracks for simply anything. For example, your sidechain as well, which takes us to our next point in this video. EQ, stereo, but all doesn't matter if your track doesn't groove as well. And that's something that I see in many mixes. Let's be simple over here. Almost all your elements, especially the melodic elements, are going to get sidechain, but it's gonna be different on how much sidechain and also the shape of the sidechain according to the element. Let's start with the shape of the sidechain. Essentially, the sidechain should complement the shape of the kick. So if you have a kick that sounds like this, essentially you're gonna make a sidechain that complements the kick, and you can end up with something like this. And you can see that essentially whenever there's kick, there's nothing in over here, but when the kick ends, we're gonna go back to how the sound should sound like. And you can do this with compressors or volume shapers like I like doing. But now let's go into how much sidechain. Well, essentially over here, for low-end elements like basses or toms in the percussion elements, you're gonna get a lot of sidechain because they're really close to the kick, and essentially they could cause a lot of conflict. The level 2 of the sidechain goes to the melodic elements that are really important in the mix, and they're also really rhythmic. So pianos, leads, arps, they're gonna get a lot of sidechain, but less than your bass. Then you go into the third level, which is the melodic elements that are more ethereal, like atmos, background noises, and also pads. They're gonna get even less sidechain, and the percussions are gonna get the level 4, which is just a little bit of sidechain. Essentially, what you want is for the whole song to groove together to make it a little bit more cohesive and nice to listen to as well. But if you want to go a little bit more in depth on how much sidechain you want to do, you can watch this video over here. Or if you're stuck on knowing where to end your mix, you can watch this video over here, which essentially is going to show you when should you stop mixing your song and move on to releasing it. I hope you liked the video, and I hope to see you in the next Abstrakt video. Cheers!